Welcome to another movie plot and enjoy the memories. A successful series of romance novels has just decided to kill its lead character Misery off. The author Paul Sheldon meets with his agent Marcia to talk about how terrible the book's going to be received by the public, but Paul doesn't want to keep writing about Misery forever and leaves for the quiet mining town of Silver Creek in Colorado to write something completely different. After he's finished with his final draft, a snowstorm hits the town, but Paul attempts to brave it back to New York anyway. Just outside of Silver Creek, Paul suddenly loses control of the car and swerves off the road into a ditch, but is lucky to be found by a local who gives him CPR and carries him home. He wakes up in the isolated farmhouse of former maternity nurse Annie Wilkes, but is unable to move due to breaking both legs in the crash, which have been hobbled back together with makeshift splints. Using her nursing skills and a bunch of codeine-based painkillers, Annie slowly nurses her guest back to health while waiting for the blizzard to pass. The nurse proclaims herself to be Paul's #1 fan, so he allows her to read his newest book since she also saves it from the wreckage. Despite not being about misery, Annie states that the book's great but dislikes the excessive use of profanity since she's so religious. When Paul replies that all kids talk the same way, Annie gets enraged and spills his soup, but snaps out of it and apologizes, showing the first cracks in her sweet, placid demeanor. Meanwhile, Marcia contacts the Silver Creek Sheriff's Department to report a missing person, having not heard from Paul for a few days. Buster assures her that he'll put Paul's name through the system, which in this small town is simply a post-it note stuck to a wall to remind him. He and his deputy wife Virginia begin their investigation at the bed and breakfast where Paul checked out of. They follow his trail to find a broken tree on the side of the road, leading Buster to suspect that the writer went over, but he searches a little and climbs back up when he finds no sign of the snow-covered car. Annie doesn't turn her head as she passes on her way home and has purchased a copy of Paul's latest book, Misery's Child, unaware that it's Misery's final appearance. She claims to have called his agent and informed the hospital of their situation, but that the only phones are in town and the roads leading out are yet to be cleared of all the snow. Growing increasingly concerned, the next morning Paul's presented with breakfast in bed and compliments from Annie, who's just read a few more chapters. She introduces him to her pet pig named Misery that she says she acquired when her husband divorced her. It was a hard time in the devout Christian's life and she retreated into books, which is when she became obsessed with Paul's novels, feeling like she has a connection with him. One night Annie enters, having just discovered that the authors killed off Misery during childbirth. She flies into a rage, threatening to clobber him with a table before throwing it against the wall above his head. Annie then switches her demeanor and reveals on her way out that she never contacted Paul's agent, and that if anything happens to her he'll die before someone finds him. She takes off back to town, giving Paul the chance to painfully fall out of bed and drag himself over to the door just to find it locked. The next morning Annie finds Paul on the ground and kindly helps him into bed, acting like the night before didn't happen. She then brings in a grill and forces Paul to burn his newest manuscript as punishment for killing Misery, but the author bluffs that his agent has multiple copies back in New York. Knowing everything about him and that he never makes copies, Annie calls the bluff and threateningly squirts lighter fluid onto her captive's legs. With no other choice, he sets it ablaze and watches as weeks of hard work burn away, while in town Buster is reading a section in the newspaper about Paul's disappearance. Virginia's also requested a credit check on Paul Sheldon and finds that he hasn't used his card since leaving Silver Creek. The sheriff takes a helicopter looking for Paul and passes over Annie's farmhouse, but she's always been such a sweet lady that he thinks nothing suspicious of her. Meanwhile, Annie gives Paul his painkillers, but he doesn't take it and instead hides it under his mattress. Then again that night during dinner he hides some more as he continues to stockpile them. The next day Annie puts Paul in a wheelchair and sets up a table with a typewriter, politely demanding that Paul write a new novel titled Misery's Return. She doesn't care how he does it, just that Paul brings her favorite character back from the dead and wants the book to be written in her honor for saving his life. Just then Paul spots a bobby pin on the floor and comes up with a weak excuse to get Annie to leave the house. He claims that she's bought the wrong writing paper, as despite being the most expensive brand it smudges. This sets Annie off again, who's enraged that Paul doesn't appreciate the effort she's putting in, and slams the paper down onto his crippled legs. She takes off in her Jeep again, giving the hostages opportunity to pick the lock and escape his prison. He tries the front door but finds it deadlocked. He tries the phone but finds that it's been gutted. While going through the living room, Paul knocks a penguin figurine off the table but returns it facing a different direction. He finds a small closet containing boxes of painkillers which he swipes a few of, as well as a small dusty shrine to her husband and a large one dedicated to Paul that looks immaculate. Annie picks up the paper from the only shop in town and begins heading home, while Paul's forced to abandon his wheelchair to enter the kitchen and crawl his way to the back door. He finds that it's also deadlocked, when hearing Annie's car approaching up the driveway and rushing back to his room to hide his escape. He manages to get inside and lock the door, making her just assume that Paul's developed a fever by his sweaty appearance. That night Paul empties all of the capsules into a single packet in hopes of using it to spike his captor and put her to sleep. By now the snow's melted enough for Paul's car to be spotted by Buster doing another flyover. Police and media assume that Paul's dead somewhere in the vicinity, having been flung from the car during the crash. However, Buster has his doubts after seeing the dents left in the vehicle's door by Annie's crowbar. He buys several misery novels in hopes of finding out more about Paul, while Virginia jokes that he bought them for another woman, but Buster says that if only he had that kinda energy. Believing that he'll be killed if he doesn't, Paul writes the first chapter of Misery's Return. However, Annie disapproves of his use of a cliffhanger. The source of Annie's malicious fanaticism's revealed when she raves about a cliffhanger in an episode of King of the Rocket Men, a favorite childhood show that she still holds a grudge against. So Paul writes a second draft and sits waiting anxiously for Annie's approval as she reads over it. This one Annie enjoys, as the writers brought back Misery from the dead with the explanation that she was just in a coma. To celebrate the return, Paul invites Annie to dinner, which she happily accepts and gets dressed up for. During dinner, Paul tries to get Annie drunk and sends her off to find a candle, giving him time to spike her wine with the codeine in hopes of knocking her out. Unfortunately, when the two have a toast, Annie accidentally spills her entire drink, completely wasting Paul's entire stash and putting him back at square one. Returning to writing, the days pass by as Paul also benches the typewriter to build up his strength to escape. During this time, Buster doesn't just read the novels, he gets sucked in and becomes a big fan of the writing, specifically one quote. As the new book's coming to an end and Paul's almost fully recovered, Annie enters one night rather depressed and talks about her fear of losing Paul when it's all over. She confesses to being in love with the author, so he tries to persuade her that he'll return, but she doesn't believe him and draws a gun, thinking about using it. She barely decides not to and leaves the house in the pouring rain, so Paul decides that now's the time to arm himself. He grabs a knife from the kitchen before coming across a scrapbook full of newspaper clippings, suggesting that Annie killed her husband as well as several infants at the hospital, getting her dubbed the Dragon Lady by the media. Feeling justified in killing her, Paul returns to bed and practices his quick draw with the blade while waiting for Annie to come in. She approaches the door, but tonight decides not to enter, leaving Paul to hide the knife under the mattress before going to sleep. During the night, Paul's blindsided and injected with a sedative, rendering him unconscious. When he wakes up, Annie's strapped him down to the bed and found both the knife and bobby pin used for his escape. Annie's discovered Paul's been leaving the room due to his carelessness with the penguin, as it always faces south. She talks about what happened to diamond miners who would steal from their masters in Africa, while calmly preparing Paul as a practical example with a hobbling post. Originally used on the miners as punishment to prevent their escape, Annie breaks both of Paul's ankles with a sledgehammer before exclaiming again that she loves him. The next day, Buster witnesses Annie getting into a bit of road rage before pulling into the store. With this aggressive attitude and simply a hunch, the sheriff goes to the library and looks through newspaper stories about Annie's trial and her apparent miscarriage of justice. He notices that she quoted the exact same line from the Misery novel that he wrote down earlier. Assuming that she's probably a fan, he goes to the store and speaks with the shopkeeper, who says that Annie always has him set aside the latest Misery book, but has oddly also been buying a considerable amount of typing paper recently. Annie gets back to the farmhouse and is greeted by Paul on her arrival, but she's followed up the driveway shortly after by Buster with the assumption that she has the writer held up there. Before Paul can say a word, Annie swiftly injects him again and hides his unconscious body in the basement. Buster is met at the door by Annie, who doesn't try to hide her knowledge of the author and instead says outright that she's his #1 fan. The sheriff looks around the house while being given a made-up story that God told Annie to buy a typewriter and write as if she were Paul Sheldon herself. When Annie goes to get them some tea, the sheriff sneaks upstairs and looks through the personal spaces but still finds nothing. Annie creeps up on the sheriff with a cup of tea, but Buster's seen enough and decides to leave, when suddenly hearing Paul knock over the grill in the basement. He re-enters the house and locates the hidden doorway leading to Paul, when Buster's fatally shot in the back with a double-barreled shotgun by Annie. She plainly tells Paul that this is the end of the road and that it's now time for the two to die together. The writer stops her, claiming for the first time to love her as well, convincing her that he must first finish his book to allow Misery to live if they're to die. But as Annie goes to get his wheelchair, Paul uses this time to sneak a tin of lighter fluid before returning to writing. Afterwards, Annie prepares Paul's celebratory items as requested by the author, including a match to light a cigarette. When she leaves again to grab a second glass to share in the bubbly, Paul soaks the manuscript with lighter fluid so that upon the cheerful woman's return he can use the match to set it on fire. As Annie frantically tries to put it out, Paul clobbers her with his typewriter, but she's not so easily defeated. She pulls her gun and shoots Paul, but he manages to knock it from her hand, and the two scuffle on the floor, engaged in a fight for their lives. Since she wants it so much, Paul jams the burning manuscript down his captor's throat before she kicks him in the balls to escape. Unable to use his legs still, the creative uses his arms to swing one of them, tripping Annie and cracking her head open on the typewriter. As Paul crawls out of the room, Annie returns for one last cockadoodie attempt at killing him, but he's able to just reach a metal statue of Misery the pig and bludgeons Annie in the face. With Paul's biggest fan dying, he returns to New York, and 18 months later has the release of a new book completely unrelated to Misery. Despite Paul saying that he wrote the story for himself, Marcia says that the critics are loving it, and suggests Paul write a non-fiction about his experiences with Annie. He gives credit to the experience for lending a hand to his current writing style and the rewards he's received since, but refuses to write about the worst moment of his life. We see that it still haunts him as he hallucinates Annie with a blade drawn seeking revenge, when in reality the woman approaching is just a waitress who tells Paul that she's his biggest fan. And the movie ends.